Hello everyone, it's your boy Jack here. Now before I start off with this video, you're probably wondering why have I made so many videos, so many like sort of slideshow kind of things about, Islamic terrorism in the US and Europe, right wing. And the reason for that is because I've had quite a fascination with terrorism for about 10 years now. Since I was 14, I'm 24 now. And it started kind of learning about 9/11, and then from there my interest kind of branched off, and I'm going to kind of pride myself a little here. I am a self-proclaimed terrorism expert. It is, I don't know, I just found it very fascinating, like how it worked and the mechanics behind it, and what causes people um, to do these acts and stuff like that. So um, and here in front of me I have, can't see it, but I have my laptop with my history thesis opened. So I majored in history at Northern Illinois University, and I and here I have my undergraduate thesis. And as you can see, I'm using this camera that I haven't used in 7 years, long time. And on top of it, I just stacked a bunch of books. So it's like kind of a dank tripod, if you will. And keep in mind, this thesis, uh, it is a little more than 32 pages long, which is why I have this thing here. This is my glass of water because I've done presentations and speeches before, and as a result, my throat gets very, or my throat, but my mouth gets very dry, and I'm sure anyone who's done it probably knows too. It gets very dry when you talk a lot. So anyway, I'm going to stop rambling and start reading. So, my title is called A New Kind of Left: The Rise and Fall of Left Wing Terrorism During the 1970s, a thesis presented to the faculty of the Department of History, Northern Illinois University, December 11th, 2018. It took me about, I'd say, 2 months to write all of this, so obviously this wasn't like a one-nighter thing, but December 11th of last year is when this all became finalized. So in this, I talk about the Weather Underground Group in the United States, as well as Baader Meinhof in West Germany. Take a sip of water here. All right, let's get reading. Terrorism is defined as the unofficial or unauthorized use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political aims. The term's etymology dates back to the final phase of the French Revolution, known as the Reign of Terror, when thousands of political dissidents of the Jacobin regime were beheaded by guillotine. Since then, terrorism has evolved into a term that not only includes achieving a political objective, but religious or social ones as well. There have been plenty of acts of terror that have resulted in extensive property damage rather than a casualty count that can be considered terrorism. On September 11th, 2001, terrorism received global attention when 19 Islamic religious zealots intentionally hijacked and crashed four commercial airliners into buildings seen as symbols of American global dominance. Before this date, however, terrorism was primarily seen as a political motive to accomplish a particular goal. Currently, in 2018, when I wrote this thing, we are still seeing Islamic terrorism being one of the biggest threats to global security. It has been in the media almost constantly since 9/11. Not many people know about the emergence of left wing terrorist networks that were conceived out of the unrest of the 1960s. By understanding these terrorists, one can draw comparisons and differences between the two. During the 1960s, mass protests erupted across the United States that addressed a variety of causes, including an implementation of U.S. troops from Southeast Asia, feminism, racial equality slash injustice, sexual liberation, and an overall end to the status quo. 1968 is when these protests would reach their climax and even grab the attention of young people beyond American shores. In 1968, leftist activists divided along political lines, whether it was Vietnam, an end to the capitalist system, or more equality for women. Some kept up with protesting and picketing into the 1970s, while others decided that enough was enough and that their voices weren't being heard. To make their voices heard, a handful turned to terrorism. Terrorist networks, such as the Weather Underground, Red Army Faction, or Baader Meinhof, Symbionese Liberation Army, the Red Brigade, targeted symbols of capitalism and government. These targets included malls, the Pentagon, Capitol, embassies, and other locations of political importance. The 1970s is when these groups ran their violent operations in full swing. Weather Underground would dwindle and disappear by the end of the decade, while Baader Meinhof stayed active well into the 1990s. This happens for a few reasons, which I will examine throughout this paper, but Jeremy Verone argues that failing to specify what exactly needed to be done in order to succeed such things such as ending foreign military incursions overseas, a new feminist rationale, or even an overthrow of the capitalist economic model caused a complete impasse on the side of the terrorists as well as the authorities. Another primary reason is because these organizations failed to speak to the masses and gain significant support for their causes. Were these objectives attainable? Given this topic is fairly new in the eyes of a historian, historiography is fairly limited. The secondary sources written about this subject are utilized extensively. Two terrorist organizations in particular will be focused throughout this paper: the Weather Underground in the United States and Baader Meinhof in West Germany. These two terrorist networks branched off of protest movements in the 1960s, with 1968 being the climactic year of a split in the leftist causes. Some continued demonstrations, while others took matters into their own hands because they felt their voices weren't being heard. What were the factors that led to their dissolution? According to my findings, these two groups disbanded for several other reasons. Ever-changing goals and objectives played an important and critical role in the downfall of these terror networks. According to communiques written about several bombings, it is observed that each attack was done for different reasons. Not addressing the issue head-on was another aspect that resulted in these groups' downfalls. The Korean War, which lasted a few years in the early 1950s, didn't spark much discontent, if at all, with American or Western citizens. It was not until the second proxy conflict in Southeast Asia, primarily Vietnam, that would cause global unrest and even radicalize some to engage in terrorism in an attempt to gain national attention and thus have their voices heard. Given this was the first televised war, people had a first-hand look at war as it happened, especially since World War II was seen by many as to be the war to end all wars. It didn't take long before people took their anger and frustration to the streets, demanding an end to the U.S. military presence in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, being the turning point to the American effort there, further altered many young minds to withdraw troops from the region. The concept of a capitalist economy was another point of contention among the rise of left-wing terrorism in the 1970s. Many leftists wanted the system to be overthrown entirely, theorizing that it was the root cause of suffering in the developing world and that it primarily benefited the elites rather than the common man. This was more of a goal in the eyes of Baader Meinhof than the Weathermen. While the Weathermen did view capitalism in a negative light, their primary focus was more about ending Western imperialism around the world and putting power into the hands of the people. This is essentially the overarching goal of the Weathermen, Baader Meinhof, and virtually all other left-wing terrorist networks during this time. Capitalism and imperialism seemed to go hand in hand when it came to pointing the finger at the root cause of every goal of the groups, the root cause of every other goal the groups had in mind. Imperialism was a term used very loosely by the Weathermen. It became defined as any sort of international influence that the United States had, whether that would be political or economic. The root of anti-imperialism came from many young activists who visited places like Cuba, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. A focus towards the developing world was also tied in tandem with anti-imperialism. This was more the case with Baader Meinhof than the Weather Underground. Feminism was another noble cause that spanned numerous leftist groups. Jane Albert wrote a letter entitled, quote, "Letter from the Underground," end quote, urging fellow women to confront the oppression they face day to day. It was also an attempt to bring about gender equality as one of the causes that the Weather Underground should fight for. Ulrike Meinhof of Baader Meinhof was interviewed in 1970, saying that being a single mother of two in West Germany is extremely difficult. She hints at the fact that the state does little to support her and other women who may be in the same situation. What her statement really displays is a strong connection between politics and what happens in one's home. There were a growing number of feminists who managed to penetrate the mainstream New Left into adopting those ideas as part of their agenda. If there were any increasing numbers in membership, it was mainly due to feminism integrating its way into the New Left's rhetoric. The early 1970s were at the tail end of the post-World War II era, where an economic and population boom ensued in numerous countries involved in the war. Take a water break here. Along with this boom came unforeseen economic and political showdown between communism and democracy, known as the Cold War. These countries were aligned with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, with the exception of Japan, whereas countries aligned with the Soviet Union, the USSR, comprised the Warsaw Pact. There were two military alliances that set the stage for any kind of potential nuclear attack from either side. The United States and Great Britain engineered numerous coups throughout the world and engaged in multiple proxy wars in Asia. During this time, in the United States, Richard Nixon was president, and the issue of Vietnam was definitely a dominant force during his presidency. In 1970, he escalated the war in Vietnam into neighboring Cambodia, igniting the clashes at Kent State University in Ohio between student demonstrators and the Ohio National Guard, resulting in the deaths of 4 students. By 1973, he announced a complete troop withdrawal and thus an end to the war at the Paris Peace Accords. Also with foreign policy, he and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev agreed on one of the first treaties known as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, towards assuring nuclear peace between the two superpowers. He also met with Chinese leader Mao Zedong in 1972, which opened the door to trade with a communist entity, and also normalizing relations between the two countries since the PRC's founding in 1949. He is noted for the overthrow of Chile's socialist leader Salvador Allende and the installation of Augusto Pinochet in his place in 1973. In terms of the Middle East, Nixon sought to avoid any kind of direct combat assistance to allies in the area. With the onset of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Nixon ordered support to Israel after being attacked by both Syria and Egypt. The conflict in the Middle East is what primarily ended the post-war boom in the United States with the start of the oil crisis. Huge surges in the price of oil caused a recession that lasted roughly 2 years, ending in 1975, but stagflation soon followed. Environmental awareness took hold during his administration with the first Earth Day in 1970 and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency along with the Clean Water Act. The Watergate scandal forced Richard Nixon to resign in 1974. This was the political atmosphere at the time of the Weather Underground's era of activity. The student radicals in the late 1960s who disrupted classes soon took their left-wing ideas to the next level. The first notable event executed by the Weather Underground was on September 3, 1969, when female members of the group orchestrated a jailbreak at South Hills High School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They ran through the school shouting anti-war slogans and disturbing literature promoting national action. The first bomb attack perpetrated by the Weather Underground Group happened on October 6th when a bomb was planted blowing up the statue in Chicago commemorating police casualties during the Haymarket riots of 1886. The blast broke nearly 100 windows nearby and scattered pieces of the statue onto the Kennedy Expressway below. These events were just the tip of the iceberg. The Weather Underground was just beginning to make a name for themselves. The Weather Underground network was born out of the aftermath of the events in 1969 known as the Days of Rage. Membership was at its height, at 100,000 members. Their task was clear: to organize thousands of youths to come to Chicago and demonstrate against the war in Vietnam, in support of the Black Panther Party, in solidarity with all political prisoners, including Black Panther Huey P. Newton, and the 8 under attack for last summer's righteous demonstrations during the Democratic Party convention. October 8th was the big day that ignited the Days of Rage. That evening, anywhere from 100 to 800 members of the new Revolutionary Army gathered at the opening rally in Lincoln Park. It was a very diverse crowd containing people from many different backgrounds and age groups. There were high school students, working class youths, hardened activists, and undercover cops. Many dressed in protective gear such as football helmets, gloves, black clothing, and steel-toed boots. Makeshift weapons such as baseball bats, chains, steel pipes, and slingshots were carried by several of the demonstrators. They were ready for anything. Despite a lower turnout than expected, hope did not dwindle as more people were expected to join the fight as the night went on. When 3 of the Chicago 8 defenders, Abby Hoffman, John Froines, and Tom Hayden, showed up, hope became reassured as all 3 spoke to the crowd. As the speeches ended, the crowd was ready for a revolt. They stampeded down the streets of Chicago towards the Gold Coast neighborhood, a very upscale community. Then all hell broke loose. Chanting and shouting echoed in the streets. Bank and corporate office windows were shattered. Clashes with cops and demonstrators erupted, and the police were overpowered, but not for long. As police used tear gas and other methods to quell the turmoil, they became in control of the situation as the riots dissipated by 11:30 that night. After the first day, 21 were arrested along with numerous injuries. October 9th became dedicated to the women's militia. Bernadine Dorn addressed the crowds that day. The mission was to raid a draft board office, but it soon ended in failure when police overpowered the crowds as demonstrators tried to leave the park they gathered in. Illinois Governor Richard Ogilvie called in over 2,500 National Guardsmen to protect Chicago. This caused the weathermen to cancel the protest planned for later that day. The rest of the day was spent peacefully protesting by members and supporters of the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, or RYM2 for short, in front of the federal courthouse, an international harvester factory, and the Cook County Hospital. This was when the Black Panther leader Fred Hampton began to disassociate the group with the Weather Underground, denouncing their campaign of violence. On October 10th, RYM2 led an interracial march of 2,000 people through a Spanish-speaking part of Chicago. October 11th was the last day of the Days of Rage. This is when the weathermen attempted to regroup and reorganize after dispersing in disarray on the first day. 300 protesters marched through the Loop as it was watched over a double line of heavily armed police. Despite this heavy police presence, protesters broke through police lines and rampaged through downtown Chicago, smashing cars and stores' windows. The police overpowered the protesters within 15 minutes, with more than half the crowd being arrested. Richard Elrod, a city attorney, was paralyzed after being attacked by weatherman Brian Flanagan. Flanagan claimed that Elrod hit a concrete wall, but despite this claim, Flanagan was charged with attempted murder, but acquitted on all counts. At the end of the trial, the Days of Rage cost the city $183,000. $100,000 for the National Guard's payroll, $35,000 in damages, and $20,000 for one injured citizen's medical expenses. 287 Weather Underground members were arrested, with the organization paying out more than $243,000 to cover bail. After the events that comprised the Days of Rage, Weather Underground was officially a left-wing terrorist organization. The group had several goals in mind they thought were important to accomplish. One was ending American military involvement in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This was the entire premise behind the Days of Rage, but it would further result in acts of terror and violence in the years to come. There was a notion that the common man could not take on a great military power by just protesting and demonstrating, so the Weathermen took it to the next level. On March 6, 1970, a townhouse in New York City's Greenwich neighborhood accidentally exploded, killing 3 weathermen. The explosion was declared accidental when bombs being constructed in an attack targeting the military base at Fort Dix during a dance event. The first attack directed towards the United States government certainly received global attention as it was reported on national news. It also damaged the home of actor Dustin Hoffman, which gave this event even more nationwide attention given the Hollywood movie culture that captures the minds of many Americans across many generations. On May 21st, Weather Underground member Bernadine Dorn declared a declaration of a state of war, in which she begins, quote, "All over the world people fighting Americans, with a K instead of a C, imperialism, look to America's youth to use our strategic position behind enemy lines to join forces in the destruction of the empire." The declaration continues with references to black oppression, U.S. military intervention in Southeast Asia, Kent State, as well as an unwillingness to coexist peacefully into such a society. It was a call to action against an imperialist power. The next 2 attacks attracted the nation's attention. On March 1st, 1971, the Weather Underground detonated a bomb inside the U.S. Capitol to protest the U.S. invasion of Laos. Not Laos, it's actually Lao. I learned that later on. This was not a surprise attack on the Capitol, however. There was a phone call received by the switchboard in which a man said that a bomb would explode in a half hour, and at 1:30 that morning, it did. The explosion caused damage to a bathroom and a nearby barber shop on the Senate side of the building. Police responded by sending out bomb-sniffing dogs to ensure no other explosives were found anywhere in or near the Capitol building. Weather Underground claimed responsibility for the bombing in a letter sent to the Associated Press. On May 19, 1972, Ho Chi Minh's birthday, the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia was bombed by the Weather Underground. Like the Capitol bombing, there was a warning that it would happen, and it did, this time at 1 a.m. The bomb was placed in the women's bathroom in the Air Force Wing. The damage caused flooding that destroyed computer tapes holding classified information. A claim of responsibility was made via communique stating, quote, after years of fighting foreign invaders, Japan, France, and the United States, the Vietnamese are now moving towards total liberation of their country. Today we attack the Pentagon, the center of the American military command. We are acting at a time when growing U.S. air and naval shellings are being carried out against the Vietnamese, while U.S. mines and warships are used to blockade the harbors of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while plans for even more escalations are being made in Washington, end quote. Radical leftist groups around the world rejoiced in the attack, especially youths in West Germany, whom resented an American military installation in Frankfurt. The attack was done in retaliation of American bombing raids in Hanoi. This was done before President Nixon reached a proposition at the Paris Peace Accords, so the Weathermen saw government as incompetent when it came to bringing the war in Southeast Asia to an end. Racial equality was another point of contention that the group incorporated into their leftist agenda. At first, it seemed that the Weather Underground organization was fully committed to achieve racial equality for African Americans. However, relations between the Weathermen and Black Panthers remained strained for several years. Despite a questioning alliance with the Black Panthers, the Weathermen launched a major bombing directed towards the New York Police Department headquarters on June 9, 1970. The sole perpetrator was Jane Albert, who detonated 10 sticks of dynamite within the building. Six months prior to the NYPD headquarters bombing, warnings were made about the attack being imminent, with a claim of responsibility of the Weathermen, with a communique stating, quote, "The pigs in this country are our enemies. They murdered Fred Hampton and tortured Joan Bird. They are responsible for the deaths for 6 black deaths in Augusta, 4 murders in Kent State, and the imprisonment of La Zeta de la Raza in San Francisco, and the continual burial against Latin and white youth on the Lower East Side. Some are named Mitchell and Agnew, others call themselves Leary and Hogan. The names are different, but the crimes are the same," end quote. Many more police targets were attacked throughout the early to mid-1970s, but one that stood out among the rest was an attack on the State Department on January 29, 1975, in response to escalation in Vietnam. The overarching cause that not just the Weathermen were committed to, but leftist groups around the world, was anti-imperialism. The U.S. was, and still is, seen as the main aggressor of imperialism. Many attacks perpetrated by Weather Underground were directed at locations of U.S. political interest. One attack that suited this cause was the bombing of the Gulf Tower in Pittsburgh. On June 13, 1974, a bomb detonated on the 29th floor of the Gulf Tower, which housed the headquarters of the Gulf Oil Company. The Weather Underground claimed this was in response to Gulf Oil's involvement in the oil-rich regions affected by the War for Independence in Angola. Angola was a former Portuguese colony in Africa, just starting off as a country, such as the United States in 1776. The Weathermen saw this business venture as a second foreign incursion on a developing country that needed to be fully liberated in order to establish a foothold as a fellow sovereign state. Many of these attacks can certainly overlap with the causes the Weathermen were fighting for. But what is important to observe are their tactics. Killing people was not their objective, but rather using bombs to interrupt the activities involving American government and society that were seen as unjust. A new term was soon coined as a result of the Weathermen's bombings: exploding press releases. Brian Jenkins, an expert on terrorism, stated that the problem with lots of little bombs is that the first bomb gets page 1 news. When you're up to the 30th bomb, it's on page 6. This is how normalized the acts of Weather Underground became by the middle of that decade. There were attacks totaling in the hundreds, especially in the early 1970s, that often went unseen because the media can only cover so much. The media can only cover so many at one given time. By 1976, the group began to disintegrate. A lack of consistency with certain causes soon triggered widespread criticism from Black and Hispanic groups for limiting their focus on racial injustice. It is also argued that the group's fragmentation began as early as 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords ordered all American troops to withdraw from Southeast Asia, and thus ending the war and accomplishing their original objective. There also appeared to be an inconsistency with their ideology and causes overall. Over the course of 8 years, objectives of the group shifted to many different leftist causes, not to mention the shaky relations with the Black Panther Party. Even the name of the organization, Weather Underground, suited the actions of many of its members who went underground as a result of avoiding the attention of the police and the FBI when they began to catch up with details of the organization later on. With the local and federal authorities caught up to speed with the Weatherman investigation, one significant bombing plot in particular was thwarted. In November 1977, five Weatherman members were arrested for conspiracy to bomb the office of California Senator John Briggs. It was later shown that the Revolutionary Committee, along with the Prairie Fire Organization Committee, or PFOC, was infiltrated by the FBI for almost 6 years. Mark Rudd, a prominent member of the Weather Underground, turned himself in to authorities on January 20th, 1978. After years of the Weather Underground Group, after the Weather Underground Group became defunct, many of its members became involved with the May 19th Communist Organization, who continued a series of jailbreaks, armed robberies, and bombings, until many of its members were arrested in 1985. The Baader Meinhof Group in West Germany actually outlived the Weather Underground network by 20 years. Why was this? Did they have better tactics or more international recognition? In order to answer these questions, it is important to provide a political and social background of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. West Germany, now Germany, underwent an economic miracle following World War II known as the Wirtschaftswunder. This was, by the way, I'm going to be reading the German names in the German accents. This was the rapid industrial expansion and economic rebirth that essentially lifted the country out of the ruins of World War II. The country became a democratic follower of the United States, lying on the cusp of the Iron Curtain, with East Germany being under the influence of the Communist Soviet Union, the USSR. West Germany had and still has a strong American military presence. The state was divided into 3 zones of occupation: United States, France, and Great Britain. East Germany was strictly contained within the Soviet zone of occupation. Germany, both East and West, became the epicenter of the Cold War. Any nuclear confrontation that would occur would leave Germany caught in the middle. In 1949, the state of West Germany was established, with Konrad Adenauer voted in as the nation's first chancellor. Adenauer was praised for bringing the Federal Republic back on its feet following the war, not only in regards to the economy, but democratically as well. He remained chancellor until he resigned in 1963, ushering in Ludwig Erhard as his successor. Erhard continued Germany's Wirtschaftswunder and also introduced a social market economy which Germany uses to this day. Because of his failure to acquire confidence in handling the budget deficit along with foreign policy, his popularity declined, causing him to resign in 1966. Kurt Georg Kiesinger became the next chancellor. Kiesinger is noted to establish diplomatic relations with 3 communist entities: Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. He introduced new vocational training along with student grants and a higher farmer's pension. During the 1968 campaign, an opponent of him called him a Nazi and urged him to step down as chancellor. While he was part of the Nazi Party, he was for the most part an inactive member. In 1969, Kiesinger was succeeded by Willy Brandt. As chancellor, he retained close relations with the United States, while strengthening integration between other Western European nations. His most noteworthy act was conceiving the concept of Ostpolitik, which was set on improving relations with communist Eastern Europe. He supported the American involvement in Southeast Asia, along with U.S.-backed coups around the world. In 1974, Brandt resigned after one of his closet aides was exposed as a Stasi agent, East German secret police. Helmut Schmidt then took place as chancellor. During his chancellorship, his primary goal was a political unification of Europe in partnership with the United States. Regarded as an energetic diplomat, he was re-elected in 1976 and 1980, but lost voter confidence in 1982 when he made the switch from the Social Democratic Party to the Free Democratic Party. Helmut Kohl was the next chancellor following Schmidt. His term took him well into the 1990s. He was the last Chancellor of West Germany and the first Chancellor of a newly reunified Germany, following the Berlin Wall's collapse in 1989, along with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. It was under his chancellorship that saw the creation of the European Union, replacing the European Economic Community and the euro currency. He supported U.S. President Ronald Reagan's policies aimed towards weakening the Soviet Union and regarded as one of the greatest leaders of Western Europe by U.S. Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. The terrorist organization Baader Meinhof and Red Army faction, or Red Army faction, was perhaps the biggest threat to West Germany from the 1970s to reunification. Baader Meinhof was named after two of its founding members, Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. The group was formed as a way to integrate radical groups across West Germany and Europe. These radical groups would unite and together would fight for their leftist aims in anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and anti-militarism, along with Third World awareness. Andreas Baader was born in Munich on May 6, 1943. His father, Bernd Philipp Baader, was a historian and activist who had been taken prisoner by the Soviets in 1945. While serving in the military, he was reported missing. As a child, Andreas was very rebellious. He never did anything he was told, to the point where his mother gave up trying to control him. He despised religious instruction, which caused him in not being confirmed. The beliefs he did hold, he would violently defend. His mother is noted saying, quote, "There were no two ways about it. You either loved him or you loathed him," end quote. Ulrike Meinhof was born in Oldenburg on October 7, 1934. Her father, Werner, came from an old Württemberg family known for producing Protestant theologians. He dropped out of school to become a locksmith and a metal worker. When Ulrike was 5 years old, her father died of pancreatic cancer. Afterwards, her mother received no state pension. She began studying art history at the University of Vienna, where she met a woman named Renata Riemek, who was studying history. Her and Renata moved in together and developed a romantic relationship with one another. From this point on, Ulrike and her sister had two mothers. Ulrike became enrolled at the School of Our Lady, run by Catholic nuns. In March 1949, Ulrike's mother died of an infection after an operation from cancer. This made Renata Riemek her foster mother. Renata moved from Weilburg, where she became a professor at the Weilburg Institute of Education. Ulrike began to follow in her mother's footsteps. She began dressing like her, cutting her hair like her, and even imitated her handwriting. Ulrike became very much involved at her school when she was on the Pupils Administrative Committee, became a member of the Europa movement, and was co-editor of a school magazine. After her final exams, she left Weilburg with Renate and moved into a tiny furbished room in Marburg, where she studied education and psychology. During this time, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer began building up a nuclear arsenal to defend West Germany, in which Meinhof vehemently opposed. In 1957, Ulrike moved from Marburg to Münster. This was one of the places that an atomic death committee had formed around a socialist German Students' Union, SDS. Ulrike Meinhof was elected as the group's spokeswoman. This is when she became increasingly involved in petitions, lecture boycotts, and demonstrations, all in the name of denuclearization. In 1959, she joined the Communist Party of Germany and was the chief editor of the magazine Konkret from 1962 to 1964. In 1961, she married the co-founder of the publisher Konkret, Klaus-Rainer Kroll. The couple had twins named Regina and Bettina, born on September 21st, 1962. The couple separated in 1967 and divorced a year later. In 1970, Ulrika conducted an interview on how difficult it is to raise children as a single mother when the state does little to support you. Many of the actions you do at home, the state can get involved in, such as physical discipline. The overarching theme that she portrays is a large gap between acting in your political role and dealing with everyday problems. She hints at the flaws of the West German government. The democratic world would view it as perfect and free, while Ulrika had much resentment towards it. In East Germany, the government did plenty to support someone in her situation. The healthcare and education of the children were all taken care of, and the parents hardly had to lift a finger. This is one of the many arguments made in favor of a more socialist-like system, such as one that operated in East Germany. Despite a strong resentment towards such a country from citizens and beyond, the group was determined to create a similar way of life in the West. The Baader Meinhof Group was formed in 1970 with the overall objective of overthrowing the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Unlike the Weather Underground, Baader Meinhof engaged in not only bombings but also assassinations of high-ranking political officials, aircraft hijackings, and even kidnappings. Another objective was to end the imperialist agenda in which West Germany was involved with. Willy Brandt was a supporter of the American war efforts in Vietnam, along with covert military operations the U.S. took part in around the world. Awareness of the Third World was an immense goal of the group, since it was believed that the United States, West Germany, and other Western powers only cared about corporate interests and not the millions of people suffering at the hands of poverty, disease, and hunger beyond their shores. The Baader Meinhof Group established an alliance early on with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. As the attack on the Munich Olympic Games in 1972 unfolded, a Black September militant demanded the release of not only fellow comrades in the Palestinian cause, but also members of the Baader Meinhof gang, including Andreas Baader and Ulrika Meinhof. The attack happened while Ulrika was in her cell at Ossendorf prison. She wrote a manifesto entitled "The Action of Black September at Munich," towards the strategy of the anti-imperialist struggle. Their first act of violence occurred in 1967, as a student named Benno Olnesorg was killed by a policeman during a clash of crowds, one welcoming the Shah of Iran's visit and one opposing her visit. The Baader Meinhof Group retaliated by firebombing the Kaufhaus Schneider department store on April 2, 1968. This bombing caused an estimated $200,000 worth of damage. Luckily, no one was injured or killed, since the bomb went off at midnight. The claim of responsibility was made via telephone call, with a prominent member, Gudrun Ensslin, scolding the German press agency on the other line. This is a political act of revenge. While one could make the argument that an attack executed at a department store can be targeting the capitalist system, Gudrun Ensslin during the trial said otherwise. "We did it in protest against people's indifference to the murder of the Vietnamese, and that words are useless without action." Contrary to their leftist agenda, Baader Meinhof did support the efforts of the Irish Republican Army during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which is still under control of the British to this day. This was the motivation behind their support of an attack on February 2nd, 1972, when the group bombed the West Berlin British Yacht Club, killing Erwin Bielitz, a German boatmaker. The June 2nd movement was an ally of the group, claimed responsibility, stating that it was a political statement in support of the IRA's efforts in Northern Ireland. In May 11th that same year, 3 pipe bombs exploded at the United States Fifth Army Corps in Frankfurt, killing a U.S. officer and injuring 13 others. This was done in protest of American imperialism, specifically U.S.-owned mining facilities located in the harbors of North Vietnam. This attack can be interpreted in many ways. It targeted American military intervention in Vietnam, but also the American or Western corporatization on a foreign land with innocent people starving, killed at the cost of starving, or killed at the cost of war and suffering at the hands of a foreign power. This was similar to the Weathermen's attack on the Gulf Tower to protest American business interest in Angola during their War of Independence. 8 days later, on May 19th, the gang placed 6 bombs at the Axel Springer Verlag in Hamburg. Only 3 of the bombs detonated, injuring 17 people. 5 days later, on May 24th, several car bombs were detonated at the Campbell Barracks in Heidelberg, killing 3 U.S. officers and injuring 5 others. After a failed kidnapping of the President of Germany's Superior Court of Justice, Gunther von Dreckmann, by the June 2nd movement, the Baader Meinhof Group successfully assassinated him on November 10, 1974. Prior to the events of German Autumn, this was the biggest operation orchestrated by Baader Meinhof. Prior to the events of German Autumn, the biggest operation orchestrated by Baader Meinhof was the West German embassy siege in Stockholm. On April 24, 1975, 6 members of the group entered the embassy and took 13 embassy officials, including Ambassador Dietrich Stucha, hostage, and then proceeded to occupy the upper floors of the building. As soon as Swedish police responded to the situation, one commando urged them not to come near the building, or else the embassy personnel will be shot. The motive of the operation became clear when at 1:17 p.m. the terrorist occupying the embassy telephoned the Stockholm office of the German press agency. The Allgemeines Kommando is holding members of the embassy staff in order to free prisoners in West Germany. If the police move in, we shall blow up the embassy building with 15 kilos of TNT. Explosives were already laid out in several parts of the building for intimidation purposes. Then the terrorist ordered the military attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Baron Andreas von Mirbach, to walk out on the landing with his hands bound. He was then shot in the head, chest, and leg, causing the lieutenant colonel to collapse. 2 Swedish policemen stripped their underpants to show they were unarmed, dragged the dying men downstairs. At 3:30 p.m., another call was made to the German press agency, this time to specify the demands for the freeing of 26 prisoners in West Germany, including Ulrike Meinhof, Andreas Baader, Jan Karl Raspe, and Gudrun Enslin. Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was then briefed on what happened in Stockholm. He then told the assembled members of the crisis staff not to give in to the terrorists. Towards 8 o'clock p.m., the Swedish Minister of Justice accepted the Chancellor's decision. The minister telephoned the embassy and told the terrorists that Bonn, West German capital, had rejected their demands. Despite the decision, negotiations continued via telephone well into the night, with a proposition offering them safe conduct in return for the freeing of the hostages. The terrorists refused and claimed that if their demands weren't met, they would shoot a hostage every hour. Dr. Hillegaard, the economic attaché, was asked to identify himself by the terrorists. He looked out a window and called, "Hello, hello, can you hear me?" Soon after, 3 shots were fired, hitting Hillegaard, causing him to fall forward, lay halfway out the window. He was dead. Swedish police were set to fire gas cartridges designed to burst on impact from a distance of 100 meters away. Before the police were able to do this, the terrorists set off the explosives put in place throughout the building earlier. The embassy building shook, causing windows and frames to fall from the 3rd floor onto the street. The detonations caused a few people to be thrown onto the ground. The entire embassy went up in flames. Surviving terrorists surrendered unconditionally to the authorities. The attack killed 2 embassy attaches, von Mirbach and Hillegat. A terrorist also died after being ejected out of the building after the force of the blasts. A year after the attack, in May 1976, Ulrike Meinhof committed suicide in her cell by hanging at Staunheim prison. Between this event and German Autumn, Baader Meinhof partook in one police officer assassination and a failed attack on a U.S. Army base in Gießen. German Autumn began on April 7, 1977, when Siegfried Buback, the Attorney General of West Germany, was assassinated during an ambush on their way from his home in Neustadt to Bundesgerichtshof in Karlsruhe. 4 Baader Meinhof members were charged and prosecuted in connection to this attack. The second attack on July 30th was on the head of the Dresdner bank, Jürgen Ponto, who was shot and killed at his house in Oberursel during a kidnapping attempt on him. The big event that would transpire German Autumn was the kidnapping and murder of Hans Martin Schleyer, of industrialist. On September 5th, a Baader Meinhof commando unit attacked the chauffeured car carrying Schleyer. Suddenly, a baby carriage appeared in front of the car, causing the driver to suddenly stop. The police escort behind them was unable to stop in time, crashing into Schleyer's car. 4 Baader Meinhof members sprayed the chauffeured police vehicle with machine gun bullets, killing Heinz Moritz, driver of Schleyer's car, and the police officer in the car behind him. 3 people also in the chauffeur and police car were killed. Schleyer was then abducted and held prisoner in an apartment near Köln. Police investigations to locate Schleyer's whereabouts proved ineffective. On October 18th, 3 of the imprisoned Baader Meinhof members were found dead in their cells. As a result, Schleyer was taken from Brussels and then shot dead en route to Mulhouse, France. Schleyer's body was recovered the next day. On October 13th, while Martin Schleyer was still in captivity before his execution, the PFLP, with the help of the Baader Meinhof commandos, hijacked Lufthansa Flight 181 from Palma de Mallorca Airport in Spain to Frankfurt Airport in West Germany. This was done in exchange for prisoner Peter Lorenz. The aircraft was diverted to Rome, Larnaca, Bahrain, Dubai, Aden, and Mogadishu. During these altered routes, Captain Jürgen Schumann was executed. On October 18th, after lengthy negotiations with Somali leader Siad Barre, or is it Sidebar, I think that's how you say it, the West German government was given permission to storm the plane by GSG 9. The West German police task force formed after the Munich Olympic hostage crisis. 1 GSG 9 member and 1 stewardess were injured. Of the 4 attackers, only 1 survived. All 92 passengers survived. The same night, the Baader Meinhof members Gudrun Esslin, Andreas Baader, and Jan Karl Laps were all found dead in their cells. There is a Thames TV special on West Germany in the wake of German Autumn. It begins with the funeral of Gudrun Esslin, Andreas Baader, and Jan Karl Raspe after they all committed suicide at Staunheim prison. During a demonstration on the night of the funeral in Stuttgart, one bystander says, "Don't let these terrorists represent all Germans." There have been moments of hysteria when friends accuse each other of being a Baader Meinhof or leftist sympathizer. During a search for suspected terrorists, police set up roadside checks to ensure public safety. Even university professors holding anti-nuclear or other left-wing ideals have been barred from teaching. Some have condemned terrorist acts, but by being open to discuss the subject, one professor was not only suspended, but was considered an enemy of the state. Students have also fallen for the fear after being considered as enemies of the state. One student states that with the Lufthansa hijacking operation, the left in Germany can be succumb to oppression and hatred. Another says that the state has no room for political opposition. You're either with us or against us. Another student says, my biggest fear is not being able to act politically in the future. I'm studying to become a lawyer, but when defending political cases, you can automatically be seen as a sympathizer if you're defending a leftist, which has happened quite a lot already here in West Germany. For the most part, the goals of Baader Meinhof, which at first involved political objectives, shifted towards releasing fellow comrades, which largely ended in failure. Although this did not mean the end of the group, perseverance remained strong among the members. For the entirety of the 1980s and even a bit of the 1990s, Baader Meinhof continued its campaign of violence, not only on German soil, but in Belgium and the Netherlands as well. Their terrorist operations were nowhere near the scale of intensity seen during the embassy siege or any of the attacks of German Autumn, but activity continued nonetheless. On September 22, 1977, Baader Meinhof member Knut Folkets killed Dutch policeman Arie Kronenberg outside a bar in Utrecht, Netherlands. This was the first operation committed outside of West German soil since the embassy siege in Stockholm. Baader Meinhof continued to wage war beyond West German soil. On November 1, 1978, another attack was perpetrated on Dutch soil, this time in Kerkrade, as two Baader Meinhof members attempted to illegally cross the West German-Dutch border. A shootout ensued between the terrorists and 4 customs agents. 2 of the customs agents were shot dead. Belgium would succumb to Baader Meinhof's reign as terror as well, when on June 25, 1979, a landmine detonated under the bridge in Mons, on which Alexander Haig, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and his bodyguard were traveling by car. 3 of the bodyguards were wounded in the car, while Haig avoided death and injury entirely. Further attacks in 1981, 82, and 84 targeted U.S. Army Air Force bases in the German states of Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Rhineland-Palatinate. Given this occurred years after American involvement in Southeast Asia ended, the group was simply trying to create an insurgency against a foreign entity that occupied West German soil. Whatever the motivation was, the group committed to their respected causes. The German military also became the target of one assassination by Baader Meinhof, I should say West German military. On February 1st, 1985, in Gauting, the head of the MTU, a German aircraft engineering manufacturer for military and civil aircraft, Ernst Zimmermann, was shot and killed by Patsy O'Hara. Siemens and Deutsche Bank are German-based corporations which comprise the remaining attacks perpetrated by Baader Meinhof in the late 80s and early 90s. Siemens remains Germany's largest industrial manufacturing conglomerate, spanning branch offices around the world. Deutsche Bank is a German-based investment bank and financial service with numerous countries around the world. After the collapse of communism, East Germany initiated democratic reforms until the state resolved. Treuhandanstalt was an East German agency aimed towards privatizing enterprises formerly controlled by the state. While the attacks targeting Siemens and Deutsche Bank, the motive was aimed towards delegitimizing the Federal Republic of Germany by attacking 2 major sources of capital. The attack towards Treuhandanstalt was seen as revenge for East Germany's transformation towards implementing capitalist reforms. Baader Meinhof was a staunch ally of the German Democratic Republic and saw the state as a model for how a nation should operate. Despite this admiration, East Germany did not want to grant asylum to any Baader Meinhof militants. One reason for this was that any attack of the group partook in against the West would be seen as a direct act of aggression and could potentially spark World War III. East Germany could not take that risk since the American military presence in West Germany was enough to intimidate government officials. The last attack perpetrated by Baader Meinhof occurred on March 27, 1993, when a newly built prison in Weiderstadt was bombed, causing $155 million in damage. The attack led to the capture of 2 Baader Meinhof members and a shootout between a member and a GSG 9 squad. There was a 4-year delay in the completion of the prison, causing the inmates to not arrive until 1997, as Ulrike Meinhof and Andreas Baader, among other commandos, were incarcerated in the mid to late 1970s. Another objective of the group became aimed towards improving prison conditions for inmates and calling for the punishment of solitary confinement inhumane. The fall of communism across Eastern Europe, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, dealt a serious blow to Marxist networks around the world. State support of these groups was severed almost overnight, even with communist strongholds that survived the end of the Cold War, such as Cuba or North Korea. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the reunification of Germany less than a year later, it was clear that the state of the Baader Meinhof group, once admired, was on the brink of utter collapse. It was also clear that an increased motive towards freeing fellow comrades from prison is what defined their attacks since the events of German Autumn and even before. In March 1998, the Baader Meinhof group wrote an 8-letter page of dissolution, stating, translated from German, almost 28 years ago, on May 14, 1970, the RAF was created. The Red Army faction was created in a rescue operation. Today we end this project. The urban guerrilla in the form of RAF is now history. The letter was faxed from Chemnitz to the news agency Reuters on April 20th. The Baader Meinhof group was officially terminated. Baader Meinhof had outlived the Weather Underground by roughly 21 years. Jeremy Ferrone argues this is primarily due to the Weather Underground admitting that the United States isn't a fascist empire, and that as a result, motivation diminished. Baader Meinhof achieved international fame and notoriety. I don't know how to say that word. Motivation was geared towards the aforementioned causes along with liberation of its fellow comrades from prison. The legacy of its original members also kept the group going as long as it did. The 1970s saw the golden age of left-wing terrorism. The Weather Underground dwindled by the end of that decade, while Baader Meinhof remained active even 2 decades onward. Even in a pre-9/11 world, terrorism was a global threat, and no war was declared upon these terrorist organizations. Something that the Weather Underground and Baader Meinhof had in common was a change of objective when committing their acts of terror. The Weather Underground gradually drifted away from the goal of achieving justice for African Americans and other minorities, causing strained relations with the Black Panthers. Baader Meinhof became more committed to basing their operations off of the goal of freeing its fellow prisoners, while broadening their reach internationally, which gave them much more recognition. A loss of membership and the pipe dream of overthrowing governments were perhaps the biggest reasons as to what led to these groups' downfalls. This can correlate with the overestimation of their capabilities. In the end, little to nothing was accomplished by any of these missions. Even if something was accomplished, it was a minuscule and short-lived victory for the terrorists. And that is it. That was my thesis. That was my 34-page thesis. 32 actually, but I have like a lot of these citations that I'm gonna post onto my video. But yeah, so that was it, you guys. I hope you enjoyed, and until soon.